its manufacturing abilities and so on, right? There are some authors and some scholars who believe, right, and apply similar logic to Singapore, that, in spite of being, sorry, no, rather than to say that, democratic, structures, are the ones that would contribute to economic development. It would be more a case in countries like China and Singapore where they say that rather, to think of it that way, authoritarian structures basically have been able to foster high levels of discipline, enforce particular long-term visions of, the government or the political parties, and that in turn has fostered high levels of economic growth, right? So that means, in spite of being non-democracies, despite their non-democracies, they've been able to foster high levels of economic growth, right? In some other states, right, it is the democratic structures that, contribute to high levels of growth. In some cases, like what you see in Southern and Western Europe, established democracies, why you see slower levels of economic growth is that the economies have matured, right? And they've sort of hit like a plateau, you know what I mean? You know what I mean a plateau is, right? It is you rise and then you hit that saturation point, right? And then, it remains constant. So once you've already hit, right, a high level of growth, subsequently, how much further can you go? So the level of growth that is already achieved, right, it sort of remains stagnant. So that's why we say, they've plateaued already, right? So these are different ways that we can understand. So just because a state is registering, 6-7% of GDP growth, right, it doesn't mean that there is an established reason for it. There could be a variety of reasons for it. It could be a combination of factors. It could be the fact that, it is a democracy or a non-democracy, type of non-democracy. Not every single state, right, that is like considered to be a non-democracy by Western standards, right, has a highly interventionist government that invests and injects a lot of attention, right, and money and investment, attracts investment, in order to foster economic growth, right? You have non-democracies that also run their economies to the ground, right? Extract whatever, the political parties extract whatever benefits that they can extract, and then, they run off, and allow another political party to come and clean up the mess, right? So it is not something to say that, all non-democracies, function in this way, and all democracies function in a particular way also, right? So that is what I want to draw your attention to, okay? Then when you look at unemployment, right, again, you would see that, Singapore and China, right, non-democracies, non-democracies, and according to this statistic, low unemployment rates, right? So again, it could be the interventionist, right, approach that has been taken, right, that has, adjusted, protection of labor, or has, contributed to, remember just now we saw the macroeconomic stabilization, that we have the demand side policy and the supply side policies in the very first graphic, the very first slide that we looked at, right? The demand side policies like the skills upgrading, right, and the welfare benefits that we looked at, right? So, you could have a scenario where that is why you see low unemployment rates, right? In other states like South Africa or Spain or Ireland and Greece, right, you could see high, unemployment levels, right, as a result of, say, for example, economic mismanagement. You could see this as a result of, say, political parties, right, who advocate a particular ideology, right? You could see it as a result of many years, right, of not addressing root structural causes of unemployment. You could also see this in terms of perhaps a very, very large, right, youth population, right? So when you have extremely large youth population, right, then that could contribute to high levels of unemployment because there's several of them entering into the workforce at the same time, right? And there's just not enough supply of jobs, right? Or you could see, a preponderance of, say, for example, particular kinds of particular kinds of businesses that, have not been the focus of the education system, right? So they're unable to supply, employment to these industries. So there are many different, ways that we can understand, right? Or they could be affected by domestic crisis, right? They could be affected by, say, for example, some states, if you look at UK today, right? Unemployment is largely, unemployment or things like, higher costs being experienced by businesses is a result of what? Brexit, right? And the backlash, that has occurred as a result of it, right? So there are different, again, the point here is to highlight that there are different, results, right? Okay. If you look at inflation, right, same thing, there's this pattern that we're beginning to see, right? Singapore, China tend to have, lower levels of inflation in comparison to other, countries, and they actually even, outperform some democracies, right? Whereas other states like Brazil, India, Russia, Turkey, right, they are emerging, or they can be, or at this point, they were considered to be developing economies. In fact, India, China, and Brazil also still considered to be largely, on that side of the spectrum, right, developing economies. Whereas, if we look at developed states, right, or established democracies like the USA and so on, they tend to have lower inflation rates, right, at this point of, examination. So, why do you think, this is so, right? Could it be a result of the particular political parties that are in place, right? If you look at, the last couple of years, look at the US in the last couple of years, inflation has skyrocketed, right? Things like rental, prices of goods and services, cost of education has skyrocketed, whereas employment statistics and wages, right, largely remain stagnant, right? There's been a lot of comparison. Things like healthcare is extremely expensive, education is extremely expensive. You've got student loans and student debts that, have skyrocketed. After paying back, the entire capital sum, right, people still owe the same amount of money, right, as a result of interest rates and so on. So it could be attributed to which are the main players in the economy, right? Have they allowed businesses, have they allowed the market, right, to basically control the levers of the economy, right? Do the political parties in power, are they inclined towards particular economic orientations or economic ideologies, right? Are they more conservative in nature? Do they advocate higher spending, right? Are they more interested in protecting businesses instead of consumers, right? Okay. Has it to do with anything related to the supply of goods? Like, say, for example, in today's scenario with the pandemic, right? People, businesses and consumers are both lamenting about costs having increased, right, as a result of reduced supply of goods, right, and or slower supply of goods. Or it could be things like, natural disasters, right? Say, for example, frequent instances of things like flooding, right, or extreme weather conditions, right, that have affected the growth of agricultural crops, right? So, for example, things like rice or sugar or flowers, right, tend to be more expensive. Why? Because the supply has reduced, right, as a result of, crops being wiped out, as a result of flooding or typhoon or drought and so on, right? So there are different factors that we can think about, right, when we are looking at why do you see these different, rates of inflation and so on. It's not just one simple thing, right, that you can attribute it to, right? Only when it came to public debt, right, did you see, a slight difference, right? Singapore, was different from China in the first instance, right, where it tended to have, quite, high levels of public debt, whereas China is still, again, a non-democracy, but tended to have lower levels of public debt, right? So that's basically, what you want to, look at all of these statistics, right? Is there, look at the moral of the story, right? Look at all the different justifications I gave you for each of these different categories, and you will realize, right, that that isn't really a discernible pattern. For each one of this, you could come up with different justifications for individual states, and you notice what I did, right? I pointed out, the developments that may have been attributed to that particular time period, right, which was up to about 2006, right? And then I looked at it in terms of how, say, for example, currently, right, what the pandemic economies look like, right, and how that may have affected it. How, say, for example, Brexit and the effects of Brexit may have affected, things like inflation or unemployment and so on, right? So basically, the idea is that different periods, right, different arrangements within government, right, different types of political parties in power, different demographics within a particular state, right? Different approaches to managing the economy. All of these have an impact on economic performance, right? Right. In the case of China, it seemed to be the natural winner, right, in all of the different categories, right? But that could be attributed to a particular governance formula that this state has adopted. Question is this: can you replicate the particular circumstances that exist in China in other states? Cannot, because size of population, land mass, resources available to them, right? The approach that the political party has taken, right? That is all unique to China, right? If look at Singapore also, can you replicate, right, what has existed in China, right? Back, sorry, replicate what is in Singapore in China because of the good practices. Again, also cannot, right? Because the size is completely different, approaches are completely different, and so on, right? Okay, so the rationale here, right, is basically you're looking at the idea that the political and policy context, right, and the different features associated with the political and policy context, right, then make an impact on the way the economy has structured, right, and the different kinds of outcomes, right. In some states, right, you may have high levels of government intervention, and that produces particular kinds of outcomes. In other states, high levels of government intervention need not necessarily produce the same type of outcomes. You understand the rationale down here, right? So there's no real, pattern, that you can actually, basically think about, right? So the rationale is that the question is, just because China seems to be on the top of all of these lists, right? Does it mean that every single state, should emulate or can emulate to start off with? Not possible, right? Okay, so that's why I mentioned that you need to think about all of these factors. Take it with a pinch of salt. Okay, all right. Let's look at this argument here, and like I told you just now, in case you all came in a little bit later, this is the crux of the entire topic. I need you to pay close attention, all right, to the different kinds of arguments related to it. For this reason, right, that is why I've categorized it as A and B. So subsequently, look at the headers of the slides, right? The different headers, the slides, sorry, the headers in the slides, right, will show you whether we're talking about the first one, which is A, or whether we're talking about the arguments related to B, right? Different kinds of exam questions, all right? Number two, please do not mix up the factors that are to be discussed, right, relating to both A and B, right? Very important. Okay, all right. And I would say this one is a mistake that I have seen a couple of students make, right, when they answer this question. They get thrown off by the phrase democracies. When they look at the question, right, and they see the word democracies, somehow I do not know how they make that connection. Maybe it's exam anxiety or something, right? But they misinterpret it and somehow start to talk about theories of democratization, which we looked at in lecture 3 and lecture 4. And I start to see people discussing things like Lipset's economic modernization, and somehow they try to make the connection between the economy and the theories of democratization, right? This is not where you include the logic of economic modernization per se and start talking about political culture and all of these things. It doesn't really fit into this argument at all, right? We are specifically looking at these points that I've identified for you on each side of the slide, under the red header and under the green header, right? So please pay attention, right, to the exam question. Just because you see the word democracy and non-democracy in the question, don't jump into conclusions. It may sound awkward to you at this point, like it sounds improbable that somebody would make this mistake. But over the years, I have seen this occur at least 3, 4, 5 times at least, right? And in my opinion, it shouldn't occur at all, right? Okay. but it unfortunately has happened, right? Because students, like I said, they look at the exam question, they zoom in on the keyword and immediately assume, they just look at the keyword and then they start writing straight away, right? Rather than to take time to plan. All right. At this point, I want to remind you, probably you've heard me say this already, right? But as you are going towards, starting revision for your mock exams, your prelim exams, right? And we are almost to the tail end. We are at lecture 17 already. I've just got 18, 19, 20, 21, right? And then basically we're done with the course, right? And then we do revision subsequently. So you really need to think about, establishing a timetable for your revision, and you need to think about, how you're going to plan out, prepping for the discussions. You all get an email about the exam format that from UOL. It's likely going to be an online exam, right? Yeah. They'll release further details subsequently, right? They said, yeah. Okay. So the logic is that if it's an online exam, likely open book, right? I do not know whether it will be proctored or not. I mean, as in whether there's like Zoom invigilation. For my foundation class, they're looking at Zoom invigilation for the tests at least. I do not know how yours is going to be like, right? But if they go by the same logic as last year, then you would have the word limit of 1,000 words per question, which you need to carefully think about, because what do you want to include that is relevant to the question? You cannot be telling long story, right, that is not relevant to the question, right? So you need to start thinking about all of these things already now that you more or less know what the exam format is going to look like. So you need to gear yourself towards that, right? Okay. So please do not look at the keyword in the question and then just jump into conclusions and make mistakes, right? Okay. All right. To answer questions on differences between economic performance of democracy versus non-democracy, meaning the institutional design is whether you are democratic or not democratic, right? You refer to two main arguments. That means in your exam answer, right, if the question is specifically asking you, how does economic performance vary between democracies and non-democracies, right? How does economic performance vary between democracies and non-democracies? Types of democracy is not non-democracy and democracy. Types of democracy is all same category of democracies. Please understand the differences between what I've highlighted in green and what I've highlighted in red. All right, please do not confuse yourself. Type of democracy is not democracy versus non-democracy. Type of democracy is the different variances of democracies itself. So presidential, parliamentary, majoritarian, and so on. Okay? All right. Yes, Asad, you wanted to ask? Oh, that was the question. Okay. Right. Okay, that is the point here. All right. So don't confuse yourself, right? So if they say, between democracy and non-democracies, right, that the ones on the A is what you need to focus on, which is two main arguments: impact of democracy and economic growth. Can you please write down there? The crux of the number one under the green category, all right, is basically looking at the relationship between democracy and economic growth. That means, right, the question that we're asking is that if a state or a country is democratic, does that create high levels of economic growth? That means the relationship, the higher the level of democracy, right, does that equate to higher levels of economic growth? Or higher levels of economic growth contributes to higher levels of democratic development. The relationship between these two factors, how are they related to each other? What is that causation? That means, does being a democracy, right, does it cause economic growth, right? Okay, that's the argument that you need to think about here, right? Okay, so the relationship between democracy and economic growth, is there causation? Is that causation important? Because we're going to quibble about this logic of causation, and we're going to say that they may be correlated. There may be this argument, right, that democracy creates conditions conducive to economic growth, and vice versa, right? But it doesn't mean that one causes the other. That means it's not a foregone conclusion. Just because you have economic growth, you're automatically going to become a democracy. or just because you are democratic in nature, you're automatically going to generate high levels of economic growth. So causation is different from correlation, right? There may be some kind of a relationship, right? But it doesn't mean that one causes the other, right? That's what we're going to focus on. That's what the argument is going to be looking at, right? Number two, right, is the discussion of the resource curse. Yeah, hold on 1 second, right? Okay. All right. Hold on 1 second. I'll come back to that. All right. When you look at the resource curse, right, number one, you have to explain what the resource curse refers to. All right. Number two, what you need to explain, right, is use a couple of examples related to the resource curse, right? Meaning that the resource curse is prevalent in particular states, like say for example, Nigeria because of high levels of oil, or Brazil, or some Middle Eastern countries, and so on, right? I've opened up the videos. We will watch the videos on the resource curse, right? And I'll explain the logic of the resource curse to you and why that is problematic in terms of generating growth. All right, okay, all right. So that's what we need to focus on. B, all right, okay. Sorry, let me answer Iyad's question. Iyad, the answer is no. Right, you do not use the civic culture argument because that is related to theories of democratization, right? So perhaps you would use the idea that I mentioned earlier on about thinking about how democracy and economic growth, they are related in the sense that they create conditions conducive to each other. But where do you fit civic culture in this entire argument, right? It's a little bit difficult to do so. All right, let's look at the argument subsequently. Then you will be able to understand why I'm mentioning, that it doesn't fit into the discussion. Okay, yeah, all right, okay, yeah, okay, all right. I'm going to close this. Okay, all right. Then you look at the red header. All right, about differences between types of democracies. Right, I've summarized it for you. The arguments are extremely simple. Right, okay, it's related to what I discussed with you earlier on about the designs, right, how that affects government spending, how electoral systems, different types of electoral systems may create conditions for higher prices, right, or lower prices, right, and let me run through the arguments first, okay, all right. Okay, how they create higher prices and lower prices, and the last one is about looking at the relationship between businesses and economic performance. Okay, all right. So these are the main arguments on this side. What I want to point out to you, please write it down. All right, please write it down. Okay, important here because I've seen this mistake occurring with some answers as well. Right, what students do is that they number one, right, they, like what I mentioned earlier on, they confuse the arguments in the red header and the green header, right? So that is something that I've explained to you already. Number two, what you need to do is that when you're answering questions related to either types of these questions, right? Okay, you need to make sure that you include all the points that are on each side of the slide. Meaning, if you're answering, a question on the difference between economic performance of democracy versus non-democracy, you cannot only just talk about resource curse, or you cannot only just talk about impact of democracy in economic growth. Meaning you cannot talk about either one or two. You have to address both arguments. Same thing under B, right? Under the red header. You cannot only talk about institutional design and public debt and then ignore the other two arguments. You must mention all the three in order to answer the question. I've seen students just, cherry pick, in all honesty, right? They pick the ones that they feel that they are more comfortable with, and they feel that if they explain it with adequate examples, right, that basically is an illustration. I've seen a couple of different papers, right, that all adopted the same thing. What they did was they basically explain all the ideas behind economic performance and so on, right? Then when it came to the crux, the body of the answer, what they did was they listed out, all right, they listed out in like a one very short paragraph these 3 points, like the headers like this, right? And then they chose to only explain in detail one of the points. And basically, when I marked that, right, I couldn't give them the marks because you are not providing a complete answer. Understand? Right? So sometimes I tell you, right, okay, because of brevity, because of your word limit, right, you want to, list a couple and then expand on the argument, right? But in these cases, if you look at, all the chapters that we're looking at, right, if there are four criterion, you have to mention and discuss all the four criteria. If there are 4 factors or 3 factors or whatever, you have to discuss all of them. You cannot cherry pick and say, I mentioned, the couple of these, right? And then, I'm just going to expand or provide details on one. And I've seen this happen with students before. So please do not do that. 3 points down here. Under the red header, mention all the 3 points. Understand? Okay, are we clear on this one? No cherry picking and just highlighting certain arguments only. Okay? All right, let me run through the arguments. Okay? All right. So Przowski, right, and his colleagues, right, basically they wanted to find out, okay, and this is the main question. Anytime you look at economic growth and democracy, you want to examine the relationship, right? Basically, this is the questions that they ask. Does democracy boost economic growth? I mean, simply by having an institutional design of being democratic, does that actually promote economic growth, right? Or if you are a non-democracy, is that a hindrance to economic growth, right? This, is the basic question, right? Does the non-democracy designs, right, do they prevent economic growth from occurring, right? So that is basically what we want to examine, right? And when we are looking at it, when we look at relationship and we want to establish these causal or correlation factors, right? What the main problem is that if you come out right and say democracy boosts economic growth or non-democracies hinder economic growth, if that is your final statement, right, then what basically that's your hypothesis. And that would basically mean that in every instance, that means every single non-democracy hinders economic growth. Do you agree with that statement? Every single non-democracy hinders economic growth. Do you agree with that statement? No, cannot, right? It doesn't make sense, right? Because they are China's non-democracy, right? But just remember the pattern that we saw, right? Okay, Singapore is technically considered a non-democracy by Western standards, or a flawed democracy, or whatever the index that they or the category that they decide to park us under, right? Depending on the year, right? But does that mean that there's no economic growth? No, right? Okay, so it depends, right? So in that case, there is no technically. We've already answered the question. There is technically no causation, right? So think carefully, right? Because what happens is that when students want to answer these kinds of questions, right, they tend to make generalized or sweeping statements without realizing the impact of this, the impact of the statement that they're making. Where after you've written your statement, right, go back and look at it. Did you inadvertently conclude, right, that non-democracies hinder economic growth, which translates into the fact, right, that every single non-democracy hinders economic growth? Go back and take a look at it. Sometimes you inadvertently make a mistake. Asad, sorry, you wanted to ask something? Huh? How do we what? That's what I'm going to go through the subsequent slide. I'm going to run through the ideas here. Okay? Yeah. And y'all will kind of be pissed. Oh, sorry. Y'all will kind of be like not very happy at the end of the day when you, after we discuss everything, right? Then when I finally tell you the final conclusion, y'all are going to be like, what a waste of time. Seriously. Okay, because after discussing everything, that's what y'all are eventually going to come in, And that's basically what I say in the slides also. Right, okay? We'll come to that. Okay, Asad, just hold on. Alright, okay? Alright, so the logic down here, right, is that I've given you different arguments, right? So I've highlighted in pink, to draw your attention to the logic down here. Okay, so when you look at argument 1, myopic vision. What's myopic vision? Short-sightedness, right? Okay, alright, so short-sightedness, meaning you're looking at short-term policies. Okay, alright, okay. So democracies, right, can create politicians with short-term time horizons, right? How do you create a short-term time horizon in a democracy versus a non-democracy? How does that come about? How does that come about? In a democracy, what happens? Huh? What happens in a democracy? Yes, elections that are supposed to be free and fair, elections that are supposed to be regular. Am I right? And in a democracy, if it's if it's supposedly to be a free and fair election, what then happens? The will of the people gets represented, correct? Which means the people have got a large voice at the ballot box. Which means the peoples, right, the electorate, they are able to provide, the ballot box basically is what? It's a report card on the performance of the politicians, correct? And that can actually reduce the time, horizon, right? That the politicians basically have, right? Correct? Am I right? Right? So that's the rationale down here. The immediate concern, right, can be re-election, right? So in this case, right, if you have a polity, right, with many loud competing voices from numerous groups who are who are demanding representation, right? What you basically can have, particularly if your democracy, right, has politicians who may be more what type? If they're seeking re-election, huh? Office seeking, correct? That means they may be more inclined to be office seeking. All right. Okay. Can you see? Can you see how we're dragging in all of these different ideas? Right. It's not kind of explicit immediately, right? But you are making the connections down here, right? So the rationale here is that they may need to focus on short-term gains in order to appease these loud competing voices, in order to ensure their re-election, right? And also, right, in the case of your elections, right, you will have a scenario where if a political party or a politician loses in the elections, and if it is more or less, right, more or less conforming, right, to these practices, associated with free and fair elections, can you have the scenario where a politician who has lost an election continues to hang on to power, right, or tries to change the electoral system in order to allow him to be in power until he's like 93 years old or something like that? Cannot, right? In a democracy, uh, yeah, in a democracy, you look at democracy, cannot, right? So that's the rationale down here, right? So there has to be an alternation in power. Am I right? Asa, I don't know where you were going with the argument. All right, okay. Yeah. Okay, so the rationale here, right, is that you would see frequent changeovers. And you have frequent changeovers, right, when you have got different political parties that come in also, right? Say like what you see in the US, right? You've got Republican, you got Democratic, then you got Republican, then you got Democratic again. And if you've got different kinds of political parties that come into power, what are they going to do? Is the Republican Party going to implement same kind of economic policies as the Democrats? No, right? So they're going to have, they change the policies, right? Okay, so all of this, right, creates rapid changes in policies in the electoral cycle. Can you see how this then leads to myopic vision, right? Or how this then leads to shorter tenures and so on? Can you see the connection down here? Okay, all right. So in this case, right, we naturally would think that, democracies, right, are very conducive to economic growth. But if this scenario occurs and you have frequent changeovers, you've got a polity or electorate that is full of cleavages, full of people who come from different socioeconomic groupings, experiencing levels of income inequality. They are from minority or majority ethnic cleavages, linguistic cleavages, religious cleavages, socioeconomic cleavages, age, gender, all of these different things, right? And all of them, therefore, would have different needs. The different needs and different wants, they're going to make these different needs and different wants, known to the politicians. And if the politicians don't deliver, right, then they're going to be booted out during the elections. And a new set of politicians come in, right? So is that stable or not stable? Not stable. Can you see? Automatically, our knee-jerk reaction is to say democracies are stable. But it depends on the composition of the democracy, it depends on the type of political parties. It depends on, I use the case of the US, right? There's polarization, extreme polarization. In another country with also a similar two-party system, you may not see the same levels of extreme polarization that we are seeing in the US right now. It almost seems like the Democrats oppose anything the Republicans say for the sake of opposing. And the Republicans oppose anything for that the Democrats say for the sake of opposing, even though it may be healthy to the economy, or even though it may be beneficial to the citizens, but they're just opposing it for the sake of opposing it. Like, who the hell says, creates, such restrictive abortion laws, and then, takes absolute, disregard to children who are already in the system, right? And you have a large number of children, circulating in the foster system, right? Foster child care system, right? Right, that's the main argument down here, right? So it depends on the composition, right? So I would, think carefully, right? Are you looking at a knee-jerk reaction and saying democracies are automatically very stable, right? And therefore contribute to high levels of economic growth? It really depends on the composition and the different factors, associated with it, right? So investments can be seen as risky if you've got frequent changeover of powers. Investments can be seen as risky by the investors, right? If you've got very diverse voices in society that are, clamoring for control of policies and so on, and that could translate into lower economic growth, because lack of investment, right, means lack of money coming in to be redistributed to industries to fund, right, these welfare programs that are redistributive in nature, that create winners and losers in the system, that fund welfare policies. Go back to what we discussed earlier on about whether it's redistributive or it's allocative in nature, right? So if you didn't understand that, then when I mentioned this, there's a disconnect already, right? Can you understand why we talked about that to start off with? Okay, all right. So that is how, you can come to this conclusion here. All right. And then, if you look at non-democratic regimes, right? Okay, say like, for example, China, right? You've got Iron Man, politicians and so on. If you look at Singapore, one criticism of Singapore is that, leadership renewal has largely looked like what? Dynastic. All right, remember that's what critics of Singapore would highlight. It's like the Lee family, basically, right? It is in power, right? And they call it dynastic in nature. But if you look at it, right, it is characterized by political leaders who have long-term horizons. Look at the PAP's vision, right, for the development of Singapore, 1965, and how it has, whatever the gripes you have, right? Okay, whether you are pro-workers party or pro-opposition, right? Or whether you are pro-incumbent governments, right? Whatever the logic is, right? It's undeniable that the policy programs and the style of economic development and so on, right, has largely remained consistent, right? And what do they use, right? Especially if these politicians tend to be policy seeking. Just now you say office seeking, right? So flip the argument, right? If they are more inclined to be policy seeking, then you would have a scenario where they're able to strategically use the state's resources to fulfill their long-term investment plans. So short-term economic pain, but long-term economic gain, right? Okay, you understand the logic down here, right? Which is basically what you see in some of these non-democratic countries, right? But that depends. Remember, I have added on these disclaimers or these clauses, right? Okay, so Singapore, China, even East Asia, right? You look at, the flying geese model, right? Or the development, just I mentioned the developmental state model, right? And so on, right? Where they have used market mechanisms, state resources, state investment for developmental goals, all right? If you're not familiar with the idea of the developmental state model, right, there are videos available. You can just Google it, right? Or you can just read the Wikipedia entry on the developmental state model. It was basically Chalmers Johnson who examined the Ministry of Industry and Ministry of Industry and Technology in Japan in about 1980s, in the 1980s, and he wanted to examine how is it that, there's such a high level of economic growth and high level of state investment and intervention, right? Basically, developmental state model looks at interventionist economic policies by a very strong government. That's the basic summary of what developmental state model is, right? So the rationale really is to think about, right, the differences between these two, right? You would think that non-democratic regimes, right, they would not foster economic growth, but it really depends on the composition, like what I've described to you here, right? The flip side, right, is that Amartya Sen, basically highlighted that sometimes you need to also consider what is the economic climate, right, and how governments respond to the economic climate. Are they able to take advantage of the economic climate, right, rather than the veracity and the fierceness of the political system? So that means it so happens that the global economic environment or the regional economic environment is conducive to economic growth. There's no financial crisis, right? The supply and the availability of the markets and the resources is all going off without a hitch, right? Then that will also contribute to economic growth, right? Okay, so that's the logic that you want to explain there. All right. Okay, why is it not? Okay, here, right? So if you think also, right, that's one argument, right? So we talked about, democracy and non-democracy. Let's look at argument two. Argument two now flips everything on its head, all right? Okay, and basically what we highlight here, right, is that governments, okay, just now remember you mentioned office seeking and policy seeking, right? Okay, logic is this, when we've discussed this before. If you are purely office seeking, will you succeed in the long term as a political party? No. Because if you're purely office seeking and you're purely only seeking to be re-elected and you don't care about what kind of policies you're generating, as long as you're in office to enjoy income, power, and prestige, right? At the end of the day, voters are also going to vote you out, right? Okay, so that's the rationale down here. So regardless of whether you're office seeking or policy seeking, right? Okay, at the end of the day, government still has to deliver, right? So governments have a major incentive to deliver good growth, simply to avoid being voted out of elected office, right? So you have to at least generate a minimum acceptable, like do the bare minimum, right, in order to generate economic performance, right? So for example, right, if you look at purely office seeking politicians under authoritarian regimes, right, they've been known also to ignore the plight of citizens, right? And sorry lah, if you're experiencing famine, I'm not going to dig into the coffers. I'm not going to change the way I redistribute and charge the elites or my business friends, right, higher levels of taxes just to create welfare benefits for you. I'm not going to redistribute. Okay, all right. So that's the rationale down here. Yeah, Lionel, could be. Yeah. So that means huh? Exploit workers meaning like what? Authoritarian government, so they're not taking care of the public, right? Or they may not be inclined towards welfare policies, even though these welfare policies may be necessary, right? Okay, all right. So if that's the case, right, then these democracies are not going to fare well, at the end of the day. So there must be some kind, yeah, correct, like what I mentioned just now, like the logic about cronyism, corruption, and so on, right? Okay, so the rationale is that when you look at non-democracies, right? In this argument, in the first argument, right, we say that non-democracies with long-term vision politicians who are policy seeking, they are an asset. We flipped it around and we said that in this case, right, non-democracies, right, who are thinking in this way, who behave in a corrupt manner, who have patron-client networks, who are kleptocratic, who are only interested in seeking the income, power, prestige of the office, so they're office seeking, right? They become the liability, right? Can you see two different ways to understand the differences between democracy and non-democracy and their responses and the nuances that are associated with these different kinds of structures? Can you see? Can you see the argument? Okay, all right. Okay, I'm not too sure what the argument is. That I have to take a look at it later. All right. Okay. So let me just finish answering this. Okay. So in this case, right, non-democracies also, right, you may have uneven representation or distribution of power, right, where you have a huge discrepancy, right? Remember just I mentioned the patron-client networks, right? And you have a scenario if you have patron-client if you have patron-client networks, right, meaning that the patrons, right, are the politicians, the clients are like their cronies, the business friends, the family members, and so on, right? And only they will be, enjoying the benefits of economic development, right? So that's where we say they allow individuals, particular individuals in positions of privilege, to amass extensive wealth for their personal gain, right? And you basically have no incentive to invest or redistribute. If I am an individual who has amassed extreme wealth, right, in a non-democracy, right? Basically, a non-democracy is less accountable to its citizens. Will I be inclined to pay a high level of tax, right? Or will government pressure me to pay a high level of tax in order to take that tax to fund welfare policies? Would no, the answer is no, right? Right, they won't be interested in that, right? So in this case you won't see redistribution in the economy. If you don't see redistribution in the economy, it's not going to garner growth in the long term, right? Okay, so non-democracies, right, they do not have free and fair elections or regular elections. The voice of the citizen is smaller, and when there's any attempt, because this logic is that if you have privileged individuals who are already enjoying levels of economic growth, right? In this case, when you have the less privileged individuals who are attempting to change the system, do you think these elites or these privileged individuals are going to allow them to change the system? Also, no. And what are they going to do? If there's a pro-democracy force, or there are those who are saying you need to redistribute more resources back into the system, what are they going to do? Are they going to say, yeah, come, let's sit down and talk how we can negotiate this? What are they going to do? They're going to quell, or they're going to suppress them and oppress them, right? So they can use repressive measures to quell or prevent disquiet at those who raise, the point that there's a high level of inequality in this system, right? Which will perpetuate uh, a scenario where the rich get richer and the poor remain poor or get poorer. Can you see how the difference in the two different arguments are? Anybody needs me to explain anything? Again, everybody clear on the difference between the two arguments, argument 1 and argument 2? Okay? All okay? All right. Okay. So Brzezowski basically saw these two different arguments and say, okay, which one can we confirm, right? Which one has got more credibility, right? At the end of the day, right? So they looked at 141 countries between over 40 years, right? And basically they looked at all the different regime types. They looked at income levels, investment shares, and everything. And because you have two different arguments that basically highlight different institutional arrangements, you have different kinds of political parties, you had different kinds of approaches in understanding the cleavages in societies, and they came to this conclusion, which I told you, you're going to be mad at me, right? After all of this drama, no real difference whether a country was democratic or not when it came to economic growth. There's no real conclusion. Can you conclude anything? Because both of argument 1, if you look at argument 1 and argument 2, right? Argument 1 and 2, wouldn't you say that in both scenarios, when I'm asking all questions, you're agreeing with me and explaining, right? Both of it has credibility, correct? It just depends on the scenario that all of these are occurring, correct? Am I right? Right? So at the end of the day, both of argument 1 and argument 2 actually can stand. If argument 1 and argument 2 can stand, right, that basically we come to the conclusion, right, that there's no actual real trade-off between democracy and economic development, right? So the entire controversy is much ado about nothing. That means we all created this drama to find out whether economic growth and democracy are connected to each other, right? And basically we can say that it depends on the political and policy context. There's no real connection between the two, right? We cannot say one causes the other because both argument 1 and argument 2 hold. They are both credible, okay? All right, everybody clear on this one? Okay, all right. So what basically happens, right, is what I highlighted to you earlier on. Correlation does not imply causation, right? Okay, so if you look at growth-induced democracy in East Asia, right, the states were basically largely non-democratic in nature to start off with, when they were all experiencing these high levels of economic growth. It's only in the last couple of decades, right, after they've experienced economic growth, did you see that they started to pay more attention as a result of demands bottom up, right, from society, that they started to create more inclusive styles of governance, right? If you look at Singapore, just look at Singapore, right? Look at Singapore in 1965, right, and how government tended to respond to citizens, right? And then you look at the evolution from Lee Kuan Yew's era to Goh Chok Tong's era, right, and then subsequently to PMV's era. How the level of inclusivity and the types of democratic structures, right, and features that have been subsequently implemented, tweaks that have been made to policies, right, and you have seen, if you look at over the years, if you look at, say, for example, EIU's democracy index, or you look at Freedom House, Singapore has actually shifted, right, for the better, right, to on the democracy continuum, right, and it has become more democratic, where it's not democratic per se, right, but it has become more democratic over the years, right. So that's what you need to think about also, right. So when you look at it, it has a scenario where, like, what you look at, in terms of developments of the societies and so on, right? These different institutions and how they are arranged, right, basically have an impact on eventually whether you see high levels of economic growth and accompaniment of democracy, right, or not. Okay, so that's the basic argument out here, right? So Acemoglu and Robinson, right, they are very significant when they discuss, democratization and economic growth. We always refer to them, right? So what basically Acemoglu and Robinson, what they highlighted, right, is that, at the end of the day, when you look at, when you want to examine, right, how democracy and economic growth are related to each other, what you need to think about, right, is the types of political decision making that is in societies, right? If you have, right, particular types of institutions that are more inclined towards kleptocratic behavior or rent-seeking behavior, right, then you would find that you would not create conditions for conducive to economic growth. But if you have elites, right, who may be authoritarian in nature, but they use the institutions that they have created, right, in order to create economic investment, right? So that means, they find it in their interest to allow new technologies and institutional changes necessary for economic growth, right? So even if they're authoritarian in nature, it is about the design of the institutions and how they utilize their power, right, to create avenues for economic growth, right? So that is the rationale that, we are looking at, right? If you look at this line, the part about prosperity tends to inspire democracy. What are we basically looking at? We're looking at the ability, right, for economic growth, right, to create conditions that are conducive to democracy. Because the rationale, remember what we talked about under Lipset's modernization theory, right? We borrowed the idea from there. We don't, refer to it as a theory of democratization, right? But we in this discussion here, we just borrowed the idea. When we talk about, economic growth, right? Okay, once you cross that particular threshold, then you can start to think about post-materialist values such as democracy. Remember, we discussed this many weeks ago, right? Okay, so that's the rationale down here, right? You've got a lot of non-democratic countries, right, that have crossed an economic threshold and therefore can move towards democracy, but at a slower rate. It's not, that they become democratic, automatically, right? But if you think, about it, why do they tend to do that? Because in the long term, if they continue to repress, oppress, quell any kind of demands for democratic institutions, right, they are going to eventually create a negative scenario for themselves. It's going to either implode, right, or you're going to have a bottom-up revolution, right? So growth strategies, autocracies, flawed democracies, hybrid regimes, they could be doomed for failure in the long term. In the short term, they keep quelling disquiet. they keep, oppressing people, they keep, not wanting to redistribute, right? But that can only be sustained for, a certain period of time. After, a long period of time, if you have got a larger youth demographic, or if you have, a scenario where you have more people who are educated, right, or people are just tired of, being suppressed and oppressed, they're eventually going to want to topple the political structure as well. So they're going to be doomed, right, at the end of the day. So, you're either doomed now, right, or you're doomed later, right? So eventually they will start to make the slow move. Not necessarily they automatically become democracies, right? Look at, the evolution of democratic structures in Singapore over the last couple of years. Last couple of decades, many people will still say we're largely non-democratic, even though we claim to have injected more institutions that are democratic in nature, right? Okay, so that's the rationale, that we argue down here, right? And if you continue to, how do you explain long-term failure? If you continue to, exploit the individuals, if you continue to not respond to their needs and demands, right? And if you continue to only have low wages, you're going to have, inefficient use of labor, repression. In the end, at the end of the day, right, does that make your economy attractive to external investors either? No, it doesn't also, right? So you're basically, cutting off yourself domestically as well as externally. And how is that going to contribute to economic growth, right? So that's why you see, right, there's no real causation when it comes to democracy and economic growth. But both of them are correlated in such a way that they both create conditions conducive for the development of each other. Okay? All right, are we clear on this one? All right, okay. All right. Everybody clear on this? Okay, understand now? Okay, let's look at the argument on the resource curse, which is number 2 under the green header. Is that the green header? Yeah, the one, yeah, correct. It's the green header, right? The one on this side of the argument. All right, the resource curse. This one, very simple argument, all right? Okay, very easy to understand and very easy to explain also in the, the final exam, right? I personally like to, describe this argument because, it's quite interesting, all right? I don't think I have the time to watch the videos with you. I'll see how the thing works out, right? If I have time to watch the video, I'll open it up. I've already opened it up. We can watch it later. All right. So the logic of the resource curse, right, is that countries with a large reserve of natural resources, right, they may actually find it harder to democratize than countries without these resources. Okay, let's look at, what are the typical natural resources that are very costly, right, that are very precious, right? So most of the time it's things like, gas, minerals, precious metals, oil. All right, so the resource curse, if you look at the arguments in the literature, right, sometimes they refer to it also as the oil curse. So either resource curse or you can call it the oil curse. Michael Ross, specifically refers to it as the oil curse, right? Okay. All right. So Michael, okay, please underline Ross, all right, because that is the theorist you need to refer to when you talk about the resource curse. Okay. All right. The resource curse or the oil curse is also referred to as the paradox of plenty, right? Because it's ironical, right? It's ironical to think, or it's paradoxical to think, right, that the poorest and the most troubled, right, states, right, actually are sitting on a huge natural resource reserve, right? And it's like, it doesn't make sense. If you're so rich in oil, how come you're still so poor, right? How come you're still non-democratic? How come you're still so poor, right? That's the basic problem down here, right? So, these some of these states, your typical, okay, examples are stereotypical in nature, right? So it's a lot of your African states, right? Because a lot of African states are actually very resource rich. Some states in the Middle East, and so on, right? Okay. Brzezowski, when they were looking at the democracies and the non-democracies, right? Basically, what they, excluded was, the Middle East, which was actually a big mistake on their part, right? So basically, when you look at the resource curse, right, you've got different kinds of states that you're looking at. You've got rentier state, you've got rent-seeking states, right? Okay. So rentier state, where the wealth of the country paid by foreign actors, that means basically the investors, right? And what happens is that, when investments come in, right, in terms of, the resources being sold out, right, this revenue that comes in, where does it go? It only goes into the pockets, right, of the small number of elites, right, who are engaged in the generation of this rent, right? They call it rent, okay? Your rent-seeking state, right? Basically, this one is an important point. Can you please highlight it? Okay, please highlight it because this is central to the entire argument, right? Your rent-seeking state, right? Okay, all right. What happens with your rent-seeking state is basically, right, these leaders who feel that they are sitting on this huge wealth resource, right? So in this case, right, they are basically not thinking about how they can allocate resources efficiently. They are not so much thinking about how, when they sell off these resources and they generate this revenue, how can they reinvest it? How can they create more opportunities for economic development and investment? How can they distribute when you take the revenue, right? Rationale is that when you take the revenue, you are either going to allocate it efficiently in terms of public goods and services like infrastructure, public health, public education, or if you are going to redistribute it, you will have welfare policies like subsidies, benefits for the less wealthy and the unfortunate and so on. But those that belong to the rentier state or rent-seeking states, they're not interested in these kinds of things. They don't do that, right? Okay, they are not creating new wealth, right? They are not pumping back this wealth, right, in and finding ways and opportunities to expand it. Okay, that's basically what you have your rent-seeking state, right? So that's what Ross basically highlights. Oil rents, right, make states less democratic because your oil wealth provides a huge incentive to resist democratization. If I democratize, that means I am taking the power that is concentrated in my hands and I'm diffusing it into society, because democracy is of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy is representative. Democracy is about the people's voice. Are the people going to sit down and say, yes, please take away all the resources and put it in your own pockets? It's okay, I'm fine with being poor. Are people in a democracy going to say that? No. People in a democracy are going to say, redistribute the wealth back to us, right? Because we are the ones, who are electing you. You are accountable to us. Isn't that what democracy is about? Correct? So in this case, right, those that are sorry, those that are rent seeking, right, and those that have oil rents, they are not inclined to do that because I'm already in a position of privilege. I'm holding on to all of these oil rents, right? Why do I want to give it away to anybody else, right? So that's the rationale. They will resist democratization, right? Democratization would necessitate the redistribution of wealth. You would have to engage in either efficient allocation or redistributive practices, like what we saw in the first slide. Remember, we talked about it in the first slide. Okay, all right. And governments of rentier states, right, they're not interested in promoting investment. They're not interested in pumping it back and finding avenues. As long as I accumulate it for myself in my pockets, I'm happy already. Okay, all right. So that's the rationale down here. That is where you have the idea. Non-democratic states, right? Remember just now we talked about, how they can oppress, suppress, disquiet, and anybody who wants to oppose. Yeah. Huh? Rentier states, yeah. More or less the same. It's just the way that we are describing it in terms of when we say it's a rentier state, right? That means largely any kind of wealth that is generated is coming from external sources. The rent-seeking state is referring to the elites within that state. Can you see the way I've described it here? Slightly different from each other. But at the end of the day, it's basically about, a lack of redistribution and lack of allocation, right? And, basically lining your own pockets. Okay? All right. All right. So, Ross basically, found out, when he did his data and his, search, right, that oil, definitely does impede democracy, right? Remember we looked at Norway, sorry, Norway. We looked at Libya, right? And Libya basically, they didn't, when they wanted to do the decentralization, right? Once your oil corporation had moved from Cyrenaica to Tripoli, right? When we talked about redistribution, so when we talked about decentralization, they didn't want to, share the oil resources anymore. Those in Tripoli were actually, already in a position of privilege, and they were resisting decentralization because decentralization then would mean that they had to redistribute the rents from the oil, right, back to, where it actually belonged, which was Tripoli, right? Which was, Cyrenaica, right? Okay, so that's the rationale down here, right? So, the resource wealth, right? What can it be used for? If I want to quell disquiet, I want to satisfy you in the short run, what basically do I do, right? I basically shut your mouth by saying that, okay, no need to pay very high taxes, right? I will also, spend a lot of money to dampen pressure for democracy. So I satiate demands, right, of the citizens in the short run. But it's just not sustainable in the long run. How long can you survive on low taxation? Because low taxation would mean low revenue for government to be redistributed back into public goods and services. So how long can you sustain this, right? Okay, so that is one thing. It leads to short-term or very myopic public policy, right? Resource wealth, right, can also be used to build a very strong military, right, or boost, say, the number of prisons that are available. Anybody who disagrees, right, just take them and chuck them into the prison, right? So that's another problem as well, right? Resource wealth also creates less development of urban industries, right? Because it is a scenario where the elites, right, they are not interested in finding out what the niche industries are. Say for example, Singapore had no natural resources. Because they had no natural resources, what did they do? They looked for the niche industry. What did they capitalize on? What did Singapore take advantage of and capitalize on? Manpower. What else? Trade, right? They took advantage of the geopolitical location, right, and developed the manufacturing industry, developed service industry, and tried to create, an education hub, a tourism hub, a medical tourism hub, and so on. The ports, right, was basically capitalized on, right? There was a necessity to look for a niche area to develop so that Singapore economy can rise up above the rest in the region and remain extremely competitive, and that was the route to success, correct? But if you are sitting on this resource wealth, right, are you going to be focusing your efforts on these kinds of things? No need, right? Because as an elite, you're already going to be enjoying, the privileges, right? So that is the issue down here, right? Okay, can you see the argument here? Okay, very simple argument, right? It makes sense, right? Okay, all right, everybody clear on what the resource curse refers to, right? And how non-democracies, resource curse, and rent-seeking states, right? Fatal, deadly combination, fatal, deadly cocktail, right? Okay, all right, all clear? Okay, all right. Now we look at the arguments in B, right, which is on slide 19, right, which is on the arguments, right, that are relating to the different designs within democracy. Just now, difference between democracy and non-democracy. These next 4 slides, right, are condensed arguments, right, on how we explain how economic performance varies within different types of democracies. The arguments we have gone through before, right, in other lectures, right, and we're just drawing the ideas together. They're very simple, straightforward arguments. Okay, all right. Okay, so let's look at the first one. We're looking at institutional design and public debt, right? Okay, so when we look at this argument down here, right, basically what we're going to highlight, right, is that you are going to compare institutional design, right, and you're going to look at the idea of accountability that exists in a parliamentary system versus a presidential system. So now you're going to shift your brain away, shift your brain to looking at the different types of democracies. All right, okay. So in your presidential system, right, okay, there are strong checks and balances, because in a presidential system, you have a separation of powers, correct? Okay. And if your president and the legislature come from different political parties, all the more it is going to be difficult for the president to enforce his position. Remember, we've discussed this before under presidential systems. Okay, if you cannot remember, it's okay. All right, go back and take a look at the arguments under the features and outcomes of presidential systems and parliamentary systems. I'm going to summarize it for you right now, right? Because at this point, at this stage, all of this should already be, second nature to you. It should be at your fingertips, right? This is why I told you, right, that this is how the cross-referencing of the topics occurs. All right, okay, all right. So in this case, right, if you have a divided government, that means the president and the legislature come from different political parties, right? President comes from Republican. The legislature comes from legislature comes from Democratic, right? Okay, or like what we saw in the Clinton era. Remember the Clinton welfare policy? Clinton from Democratic, right? He wanted to propose a welfare policy. The Republicans didn't agree, and then they kept proposing something that was very far from his ideal point, right? And then he had to keep vetoing it, and they had to keep proposing a different policy, right? So when you have this, right, it essentially functions as a check and balance, right? And it makes it very difficult to change policy drastically, right? Whereas in a parliamentary system, right, like say for example, like what you see in Singapore, when you have a parliamentary system, especially one that has got a strong majority, that means you have got more than a 2/3 majority in parliament, right? What do you actually see? In a parliamentary system, right, the prime minister and his cabinet, basically they have the agenda setting power. They have monopoly over setting the agenda, correct? Right? And if I have monopoly over setting the agenda, what does that mean? I can make policy swiftly. I can make policy with a lot of ease because I monopolize the agenda setting, ability, correct? Right? There are very few veto players, unlike what you see in a presidential system. And even in a presidential system, right? Even if the president, right, and the legislature come from the same political party, because there's a separation of powers, right? Is the legislature beholden to the president? No, they are not. They are not beholden, right? So the rationale is that they can help the president to propose policies, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to agree with everything that the president says, right? Okay, remember we've discussed this before, huh? All right, okay, I remind you again, it's okay, please don't panic, right? If you feel that, some of this sounds a bit alien or you cannot remember, right, some of these things, right? Go back and take a look at that set of lecture notes, right? Okay. Okay, so in this case, right, if in a presidential system, it is more difficult to change policy, whereas in a parliamentary system, it is more easy, right, to enforce a particular policy based on, your particular agenda. In a presidential system, you are less likely to run high levels of public debt because how can you willy-nilly, anyhow, introduce policies to increase public spending because your legislature is not going to be agreeing to you spending that money, correct? Because there's a separation of powers. Because there are checks and balances, there are veto players, it is difficult to change policy. Whereas in a parliamentary system, right, it is quite the opposite. I have agenda setting power. So I can decide if I want to spend more money on defense, I can do so. If I want to spend more money this year on, say, look at the budget in Singapore in the last 2 years, right? Was there any opposition? There was grumblings about how it may be detrimental in the long run to keep dipping into the reserves, right? But was anybody able to stop government from doing so? Parliamentary system. But if this was a presidential system, it might be slightly different, right? Look at Biden struggling, right, to enact certain policies regarding to the erasing of public the student debt, and the loans and so on, or struggling to inject, the stimulus, packages, right? How they have to, keep, deferring to the other political party and, trying to find a middle ground and so on, right? Look at the difference between the two. Okay, all right. Then look at the same logic, right? When we look at institutional design. So first argument was on parliamentary presidential. Second argument is on majoritarian versus consensus, right? So in a majoritarian system, right, you're going to get a two-party system like you all highlighted earlier on, and that would give you strong single-party governments, majoritarian systems, right? Whereas in a consensus or a PR system, you may likely get a coalition government, right? So that's the basic difference between the two. Let's go back to majoritarian systems, right? So in the case of a majoritarian system, right, okay, what happens is that there's high levels of accountability because, say for example, in Singapore, the PAP, if the PAP makes a decision, you know exactly that whatever policy that has occurred, right, is an outcome of decision making by the PAP. You know exactly who to reward or who to punish. In the last election, the PAP was rewarded because of the way that voters thought that they handled, right, the pandemic, right. So there were a good number of voters who said, okay, we will continue to think about, how they have, kept the government afloat, they have kept the system afloat, even in a scenario of crisis, right? Okay. So what happens is that you would also have a scenario because of this high level of accountability, right? You have a system of government, right, that is highly responsive to citizen preferences because if they are the only government in power, right, only political party in power in that forms government, right, they would need to satiate citizens' demands. Why you want to satiate citizens' demands? Because you can be rewarded or punished very easily by the ballot box. Political parties are interested in seeking re-election, correct? So you don't want to be voted out, right? You want to satisfy your citizens, right? Okay, and also, right, in order to make sure that you are voted in again and again, right, there must be sound economic policies, right? So can you anyhow spend money and create, run your economy to the ground? Cannot, because again you'll be punished, right? Okay, because it's very clear that it's your fault, right? So in this case, right, majoritarian governments, they are less likely to run high levels of public debt. Whereas when you look at a coalition government is made up of several different political parties. So what is going to happen in these several different political parties is that these different political parties feel that they are duty bound, right, to respond to the demands of all the different constituents. When they respond to all the different constituents, these different types of constituents, right, have different needs, different wants, different demands. Whereas in a majoritarian government, say for example, if your majoritarian government came into power with like 30 something percent, like Harper's government, or 40 something percent, or even 50%, who do they actually need to satisfy? In a majoritarian scenario, I only need to satisfy the majority. Whereas in a PR system, even those political parties that win 10%, 16%, 20% of the vote can form government, correct? So in this case, what are you going to do if you are in a scenario where you have a PR electoral system? You're going to be more conscious about making sure you respond to all your constituents, right? So in this case, they're responding to different constituents' interests. It's likely going to generate high levels of spending because you're responding to everybody. In a majoritarian system, I just respond to one group. And if I can secure their satisfaction in the next election, I will win again, right? Because I only need to respond to that one group, right? So that's why you tend to see higher levels of public debt in a consensus or a PR style system. It's who they are responding to, who they are accountable to. Understand? Okay? Simple argument, right? Right. Okay. Then you look at consumer prices, right? Electoral systems and consumer prices. In all systems, regardless of whether you're in a PR system or whether you are in a majoritarian system, right? All consumers, they want lower prices. Who wants to pay higher prices for anything? Nobody, right? Okay, so that's the logic here. And so consumers want to pay less, right? And producers, because they are profit maximizing businesses, right? Producers, because they are profit maximizing. What is the issue down here? They desire government regulation. Remember, we said regulation is costly to producers, right? If they are meant to abide by particular standards, if they are meant to abide by particular regulations. So what is it that producers want? They want regulation that will protect them, that will allow them to charge higher prices. They don't want their cost to increase. They want their profit to increase. So they are going to be inclined to charge higher prices, right? Whereas consumers want the opposite. They want to pay less, right? So this is a conundrum that exists in society between consumers and producers, right? So in a majoritarian or a two-party system, right? Okay, what happens is that your political parties, if you say like, for example, in the UK, right, you've got Labour and you've got Conservative, right? Okay, so you've got two-party systems, right? They want to win the elections. Who would they respond to? They would respond to the median voter, right? Because that is where the majority of voters are all clumped, right? Remember the median voter, right? That is the representation of, the entire electorate, right? And they would be very responsive to the voter preferences, because I have a 50-50% chance, right, of winning in the election. It's either me or the other political party, right? So in order to ensure that I garner the majority of the votes, I have to make sure that I'm responsive, correct, to what the voters want, right? So in that case, right, the median voter is the one who's got a very large voice in this entire system. And what does the median voter want? What does the voter want? The voter is a consumer, right? They want lower prices, correct? Whereas in the PR system, are they so concerned about the median voter? Are they so concerned about getting the majority of the votes? No. If there is a low threshold, right, to win in the elections, right, maybe the threshold is at 8%. Even if I get 10, 16% of the votes, 20% of the votes, I attract, that particular constituents, right? I can actually enter into parliament. I have a chance to enter into parliament, right? So in this case, I would attempt to capture the sectoral interest. That means I only want to attract, a particular group of people. And if I get enough people from this particular sector who will vote for me, I can enter into parliament. Like for example, your green parties, who will they appeal to? They'll appeal to the youth. They'll appeal to those who are your social justice warriors type. They'll appeal to those who are interested in climate change, right? Your conservative parties will appeal to a particular sector. Your Christian democratic parties will appeal to a particular constituent, correct? So do I have to appeal to the median voter or not? No. If I don't have to appeal to the median voter, right, then I may be inclined to commit to regulation that satisfies a particular group of interests, right? So in this case, if you have a majoritarian system, because you're appealing to the median voter, and the median voter is the typical consumer who wants to pay less, right? In a majoritarian system, consumer prices should actually be lower. In a PR system, especially if you have political parties that are responding to business interests or sectoral interests or a particular agricultural group or a particular farming group or a particular automobile group, they're not going to be interested in other sectoral interests, because I only am catering to that group that is looking at how they will get me into parliament. So it's okay, right? I will be inclined to protect them instead. I don't care about the median voter. I don't care about the consumer, right? I will look at what my own constituents want. The majoritarian system, they cannot afford to do that. They must appeal to the median voter because they need to amass as many votes as possible to hit either the absolute majority or at least the simple majority. You understand the difference between the two? Okay, all clear? All right. Okay, and then we come to the last one, which is the varieties of capitalism, right? You're looking at the different types of market economies, right? So the first two arguments looked at very simply institutions. We looked at whether it is parliamentary, we looked at whether it is presidential. We looked at whether it is PR or consensus style, and how these affect the way the political parties respond, how this affects the way agenda setting occurs, how this affects the way the politicians respond to the individuals, right? In this last argument, what you're basically looking at is the relationship between business and government, right? How politicians, business, and in an extension of that, the labor groups, right, are significant. Why do we want to examine this? Because it is business and labor groups that actually generate wealth in a particular country. So the different kinds of arrangements in different types of economies, whether they are liberal market economies or whether they are command market economies, would then impact, right, on what is being protected, whose interests are being protected. Whose interests are being protected then would correlate to how much money is being spent, right? So the logic down here, right, is that if you have a liberal market economy, right, you would have a relationship between labor and business, like regulation of market, right? That means, in this case, does government interfere in the market if there's light regulation? Do they intervene or interfere? They don't. It's very light regulation, right? So if there's very light regulation, would employment or labor be protected? No, they won't, right? They will not be looking at things like minimum wage, or they will not be looking at things like safety regulations and so on, because it's basically leaving it to the devices of the market itself, right? So lower levels of employment protection. So if government, if government doesn't intervene so much, doesn't impose so many rules and regulations on businesses, is it costly for business or not costly for business? Not costly for business. Not costly for business means businesses can actually seek higher profit margins because my cost is low, right? So I can actually seek higher profit margins, which would then make my market very competitive, correct? Because many of them are actually seeking higher profit margins. If there's less regulation, right, and the businesses can compete with each other, remember like what I mentioned just now, the peanut butter example, right? There will be a lot of different businesses that are competing against each other. If they're competing against each other, what are they also trying to do? They want to get that particular consumer to buy from them. So will their prices be high or will their prices be low? Low, huh? High price or low price? Low prices, because I want to attract consumers, correct? Okay. And in this case, right, they will keep pumping in short-term investment, right? Okay. And because there's no protection of labor, you may tend to see higher rates of unemployment. Okay. Whereas in a command market economy, quite the opposite, higher levels of intervention. So closer working relationship between government, right, and labor business interests. There's a higher regulation of the market. When there's higher regulation of market, it becomes expensive for the producers because they now have to conform to what government is demanding them to do. So they have to spend money on green technology. They have to spend money on looking after their labor, right? They have to, and when they spend more money, what do they tend to do? They pass off the cost to who? Pass off the cost to who? Consumers. Pass off the cost to consumers means you've got higher prices to pay. Can you see the difference between the two? All right. Then, but what you will also see is that less competitive markets because they are paying higher prices, right? And you would have high levels of labor protection, right? So you would see long-term investment because if you protect your labor, you would be actually interested in ensuring that they're paid on time, they are paid fairly, and you would also be interested in protecting labor, so you would also pay for skills upgrading, training, and so on. So this leads to eventually your labor market becoming more skilled. And if the labor market becomes more skilled, right, there's more, investment in training of workers and so on, that becomes a long-term investment strategy because in the long run, your labor can respond better to any kind of kinks that occur, like economic crisis and so on, because they're already well prepared already, right? So that is the difference between your liberal market economies and your command market economies. Basically, what you would see at the end of the day is that in your liberal market economies, it's very short-term investment thinking, right? You've got higher rates of unemployment because you've got less regulation, right? But it becomes beneficial to consumers. But all of this is in the short term because if you keep hurting your labor, right? Your labor is not going to work. Like, look at in America right now, right? What are you seeing? People mass walking out of Amazon. You have your Nabisco, and Nestle, right? Your snacks production companies, right, have come to a standstill. Why? Because people say, I don't want to work anymore. People are quitting from Amazon, right? Because they say we're not being paid, we're not being protected, right? And when that happens, companies cannot produce. Companies cannot produce means you're not going to have goods and services. Then you're going to have scarce goods and services. Scarce goods and services means higher price or lower price. Higher price. Logic, right? But this is, you don't even have to be an economics expert, right, in order to understand this demand and supply logic. Correct? Okay. So that's what you see in your liberal market economies. 1 minute, okay? All right. And then what you're going to see in your command market economies, right? Closer working relationship between government and business, right? Your labor interests are being protected, higher levels of intervention, right? And at the end of the day, it is going to be beneficial to employment because of training and upgrading. So it is more long-term benefit, right? So at the end of the day, your command market economies actually become richer than your liberal market economies because of these long-term investments. Okay, all right. Are we clear on this one? Okay, I will do a recap for you because we covered a lot of material today. All right, I tried my level best to squeeze in as many things as possible and to make things as clear as possible. All right, I will do a recap for you when I see you all next week. All right, before we continue, let's do this. Right, if there are any questions, if you're confused about any element, right, please let me know. Right, either via email or bring it up when we do the recap next week, right? And then we will discuss the other elements, okay? For lecture 18, okay? All right. I'll see you all next week. Sorry, I overshot a few minutes, right? I will see you all next week. Take care. All right. Bye. 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 Ryan, Singapore closer to command market economy? I would say so. Yeah, because there's high levels of intervention. Yes. Okay, Ryan. All right. Okay. See you. Bye. Bye.